Welcome to Uncharted HR, the podcast where we navigate the unexplored territories of human resources and workplace innovation. I'm Dr. Robin Ladwig, your facilitator and guide on this journey into the future of HR. In today's digital-first workplaces, electronic human resource management systems have become the backbone of how organizations manage, develop, and understand their people. But as we lean into data-driven decision-making, a critical question emerges. Are these systems truly inclusive, or are they unintentionally reinforcing existing gaps of workforce planning? In this episode, we are diving deep into inclusive E-HRM through the lens of people analytics. We explore how organizations can use data not just to optimize performance, but to empower every employee regardless of background or ability. Together with the fantastic industry partner, Catherine Jeffries, we will unpack questions like, how can people analytics be used to promote inclusivity within an organization? Or what are ethical considerations when using people analytics in E-HRM? And what capabilities do people need or need to develop to engage with people analytics inclusively? Whether you're an HR novice, a people analytics expert, or an experienced workforce planner, or a tech leader looking to build more inclusive workplace solutions, this episode will challenge your assumption and offer actionable strategies to drive meaningful change. So grab your logbook, settle in, and let's chart into new territory together. This is Uncharted HR, and today we're exploring how the future of inclusive HR is being written in code, shaped by data, and driven by our shared commitment to equity. Hello, Catherine. Welcome.
Hi, Robin.
It's so nice to have you here today. And I pretty much will throw the first question at you, which is, how can people analytics be used to promote inclusion within an organization?
It's a very interesting topic, and one that I guess I deal in every day. So I guess to start, just to be clear, what we're talking about when it comes to people analytics is data, and not just one source of data either, but we're looking at workforce data from both a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. And we're looking at it from the point of view of solving business problems. And when it comes to, let's say, the problem of inclusion, we can use data from our workforce, honestly, to drive change, positive change. Often inclusion is perceived as something sort of non-tangible or even fluffy, in the workforce, a kind of fluffy HR. But research really has shown us that it's actually very tangible. Research, for instance, from the Diversity Council of Australia shows that inclusion occurs when people feel respected, when they're connected, when they're contributing, and when they're progressing. So if we take one of those pillars, for instance, progressing, it's actually really easy to take a data perspective and look at how we can progress and how different cohorts of people can progress or not progress in the workplace. So, for instance, in many workforces, we see that for the progression of people with disability or people who are First Nations, their progression will stall, often at the middle management levels or senior leadership. I am a public servant, and we've realised in recent years that it stalls for going into senior leadership for called employees. And so we can really use that data to understand where those barriers are and to also make inferences about, why that's happening. Are there power imbalances in the workplace? Is there bias in attraction and recruitment? Even workplace stigma or discrimination. And what's more, if we then marry that data set up with other data sets like qualitative data, for instance, from focus groups or engagement surveys, we can really get a full picture, a really strong evidence-based understanding of where people are and where or why they're not included in the workplace.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights. And I know it's a huge question to dive into. And I think, like you already mentioned, a couple of challenges that you know about when it comes to implementing people analytics. You mentioned about the opportunity to step up for senior leadership positions, but how do we actually can overcome them?
Yeah, overcoming those challenges is hard. So I've now worked in a number of different public service organizations, and it's something that, again, we grapple with every day. I think one of the challenges that we find, if I can speak to another challenge, is on missing data. So it's when the data just isn't there. And we continue to see a lot of organizations simply not capturing the information that they need around, for instance, the demographics of the workforce or the experiences of those people. And whether it's due to, let's say, a lack of funding or a lack of resourcing or even just a lack of D&I maturity, we are still faced with this challenge of missing data. And so overcoming that is essential, and we can overcome it. We can build those data sets. Sometimes it's literally just about including people, about asking for the data. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer and it's a bit of a process of building the right systems. Yeah.
Because you brought it up about qualitative data and quantitative data. Can you maybe elaborate a bit about like the benefits and opportunities to use qualitative and quantitative data in people analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I've mentioned it before as well. There's so many benefits with using quantitative. So the quantitative is often seen as the hard data. You know, who we have in an organization, what do they look like, for lack of a better way of putting it? What are the demographics of an organization? And that's somewhat the easy part. You know, it's based on people's reporting of their own diversity data, for instance. The qualitative data, though, I think is equally as interesting. It's around really engaging with people, engaging with them in discussion, in focus groups, in interviews, engaging with them through surveys. And that can just provide this whole new understanding, this whole new set of data and people analytics that can really help us move the workforce forward from a diversity and inclusion perspective.
Absolutely. And I think it just reminds me how important it is to do storytelling with the data. Therefore, you do not just rely on quantitative data, your numbers, your hard facts, but also the experiences, the perspectives of the employees due to qualitative data, to storytelling. And you potentially touched on it, but I would like to push you a little bit further even. How would you explain people analytics to your 9-year-old cousin? Because sometimes people analytics is this mystic, oh yeah, all IT, all tech stuff, but how can we break it down?
Absolutely. So this is such an interesting question, and I really had to think about this, because a child, for instance, has a very different understanding of the world to an adult without the years of experience in HR and in the workforce. So I had to go online and I had a look, at what the AI said, right? And there were some interesting things, interesting examples that others people gave. And one was this. They said, give a child a chocolate every day for a week. For the first 2 days, give the child the chocolate in the afternoon. In the next 5 days, give the child the chocolate in the evening. On the 8th day, in the morning, ask the child the question, are you expecting a chocolate today? Why? If yes, at what time are you expecting it? And then if I don't give you the chocolate today, would you expect it tomorrow? If your cousin answers all those questions, then you tell them, there you go. That's what people analytics is. And I really like the example because it demonstrates trends. And people analytics is hugely about trends and being able to sort of forecast what happens or what might happen in the future, as well as looking backwards. I also like it because it really demonstrates that human behavior, and how people are motivated. I think from a D&I perspective, though, I would add another part to that question. It would be something along the lines of, if I don't give you a chocolate today, does that mean I've given it to someone else? And if so, who? And so it starts to get your 9-year-old cousin to think about people and different people. Who has privilege, who gets the opportunities, or who gets the chocolate in life, if you will.
That was such a great metaphor, and I don't think I ever heard it. So that was really a helpful explanation. And again, it shows also the interconnection. It's not about data in the first place. It's about the human and their expectation, their behavior, their well-being, their needs, and how this all fits in the wider picture of an organization and the networks within an organization. So thank you for that amazing example.
You're welcome.
You probably also have a beautiful scenario for my next question. Can you think or discuss a scenario where people analytics led to actually actionable insights for improving inclusivity?
And look, this again is something that I've sort of done day in and day out throughout my career, but I think there's a really prime example I can use from an organization I worked for a number of years back. So at the time, I was an employee of Department of Defence and I worked for the Australian Army, and we were working on the removal of gender-based employment restrictions to combat roles. Now, at the time, this was a new change, a change to the workforce that came about as a result of legislation. So it was something that Defence had to do. It's very well publicised as an example, and yet it was a very different change in terms of diversity and inclusion and how the workforce interacts. And people analytics was really used quite substantively in making that change. So for instance, the workforce really had to ask of itself, how many people can we reasonably expect to apply for roles? So using people analytics to do some forecasting, how can we anticipate trends in applications? How many are we going to get a bulk of people all apply at the same time, or just a handful? Again, that's forecasting. What are the data-driven methods to ensure that women are the best fit for the role when they're applying for combat roles? What data can we use to ensure that the women who do apply have the right capabilities? Or in this instance, it was largely about physical requirements. Can they physically do the job? And also things like, to what extent are we introducing women into safe or unsafe environments? Combat role is very different to some of the other roles within the Defence Force. And so how are we supporting women once they're there? And just as a note, I mean, Defence did make those changes and they've been very well received, to my understanding, and the world didn't collapse. So I think people analytics was used well in that instance.
That's a great example. And I wonder, just thinking about it, there's probably quite a few different stakeholders involved in a process like that. So you can't actually show or tell the same story or show the same results in the same way you maybe would show it to a colleague you're working together with in people analytics itself. How would you communicate the findings from people analytics to various different stakeholders?
It's an interesting one, partly because people will never have the same levels of maturity data literacy when it comes to people analytics, especially in HR. We really come from a diverse range of backgrounds. Some of us in HR, we specialize in one thing. Some of us have a much more generalized take on HR and generalized experiences. And so being able to then communicate, people analytics to stakeholders, you've really, I think, got to, go differently and go as is needed. And I think sometimes that means being able to tailor to your audience. So, for instance, in my situation, I'm a public servant. On a daily basis, I might engage with anyone from a secretary of a department to a graduate. I then might engage with externals outside of the public service entirely, so members of the public. And being able to communicate what you need to differently is really important. I tend to think when you're communicating people analytics that less is more. So sometimes we have this urge to provide as much data as humanly possible, and it's rarely to our benefit. So I think we need to be really careful about what the message is, what is it that we're trying to tell people, and recognize as well that data can be overwhelming, specifically in instances where people's maturity levels do differ. From my point of view, I also love to be able to engage a narrative. I'm a bit of a storyteller myself. I like being able to tell the story or use a visual approach, so that people aren't just sitting there reading stats. I think when it comes to diversity and inclusion and that intersection with people analytics, it's so important to really humanize the data. And often that means explaining the why. Why is a certain trend occurring? Why have people reported in the way that they have? Answering that why is imperative, and it really helps with communicating the information.
Pick up on some of the points you made, highlight how significant I find them from my perspective. And one is that you have to be really clear about the message. So zoom in what is actually important to get across. And it's a common rule of thumb for so many things. It's what is the one message you really need to get across. So be focused on that. I also liked your explanation of the why is important. I heard the term about collective intelligence in the sense of like you use, for instance, automation or AI or technology helping you in the analysis of the people analytics data you have available. But at the same time, the why there's prediction models, that's not the point, but like the why can only be explored or come anywhere close to the truth to have a much more holistic perspective in the meaning. You actually need for instance, their HR professional who has the insight of the organization and what's not captured in the data to actually explain why it actually happened in that way based on the data that was collected. There's the human in the loop we should keep. So really find some fantastic insights in that sense, which also reminds me of like ethical considerations and lead me to the next question of what are actually ethical consideration when using people analytics in electronic human resource management.
And I think, as you've guessed, I mean, working in D&I and even in this conversation, like it's so important to humanize everything that we do and to consider the person and the individual and their rights. And that includes taking into consideration the ethics, the ethical side of E-HRM. And I think we need to be really cognizant that anything that we do that involves digitizing or the use of technology needs to have that ethical consideration. Whenever we take something out of our own hands and give that power to something else, in this case, technology, we need to recognize that there's a risk. There is an ethical risk just as much as there is opportunity. And I think we need to understand that, our HRM systems have been developed by people. They've been developed by people for people, and which makes them inherently biased. And that means that by their very nature of being, they're going to replicate biases that exist within the human population and exist within their makers, if you will. And we know that this is happening in AI. For example, we know that AI itself is biased. And so I think some of the ethical considerations are around ensuring that our systems maintain people's dignity. And often this is through maintaining privacy and confidentiality. I also think there's a need to communicate. Again, the why is so important in everything we do. It's about why is the data being collected in the system? How will the system hold the data? What will it do with the data? Who can see it once it's in the system? So that a transparency and that communication is vital. I think as a final point, and it's on again that matter of giving the power over to the technology, is that there is this incredible need for accountability. I mean, we can introduce systems that, of course, are going to have glitches and there'll likely be data breaches. And there's always going to be hackers who, try and access our data. And we can blame that on the system itself. But similarly, someone has to be accountable for what we develop. Someone's got to be accountable for the systems that we use because in the end, they're our systems. And so that accountability from an ethical perspective, I think is really important. Putting that back in the perspective of diversity and inclusion, I think it's just so important that we can demonstrate that accountability because that's when we build trust, with our people and with our workforce. And that really is central to inclusion.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking while you were talking about the general issue you also mentioned before about disclosure, specifically in the diversity and inclusion space, where we have quite personal questions. For instance, when we're talking about disclosing disability, or when we're asking, are you Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person? And I was thinking, because everybody is grappling with this question, how can we get the data by being ethical and appropriate at the same time? And I think you already mentioned a few things, like make sure to your people the why you're collecting that data, also what's happened with it, so be transparent about the processes around it. But I also like the point, and I think it is not spoken enough about it, accountability. Who is accountable for collecting it, looking after it, maintaining it, protecting it? So only then we can move towards trust, which then again makes disclosure or sharing more sensitive information much easier for everyone and helps you to get better data and then do better work for your employees, I guess.
Yeah, I think you make a really relevant point. Disclosure or sharing, as some people prefer to put it. Again, it comes back to the why we're asking people to share. Are we just being curious busybodies, or are we genuinely going to use that information to make change? I try to be an optimist and hope it's the latter. But yeah, absolutely. Trust is so inherent to encouraging sharing for the right reasons.
I'm really curious about to hear your perspective. And that is, what unexplored capabilities should human resource professionals or your everyday manager develop to ethically and effectively engage with AI-driven people analytics?
Look, in terms of unexplored capabilities, I'll avoid the AI question and come back to that. I'm a really big advocate for maturing the capability of HR employees around qualitative data. I think there's so much weight is given to quantitative data when it comes to workforce management and HR generally. We really tend to rely on that. It's seen as, the hard stuff. And in the world of D&I, sometimes we're relegated to the fluffy. So they're almost seen as opposing. And yet, um, I really would love for us to be able to explore the qualitative a little bit more, because there is, as we've said, just so much information. There is a wealth of information that we can gain from people's perspectives, from their voices around why they behave the way they do in an organization, how they're impacted by organizational cultures, policies, practices, routines. I'd love to see a sort of uplifting capability in that space. But that's something that already exists. So when it comes to unexplored capabilities and emerging technologies like AI, that's a whole new world, right? um, it and the world is really our oyster. It's both fascinating and exciting and a little bit terrifying. And when it comes to AI, we'll just call it a bugbear. I don't know. My thoughts at the moment, I guess, is that I'm really keen to ensure that we do get it right in terms of the ethics and ensuring that AI really does uphold the dignity of the people who use it and their information. And I think that we can make that happen. We can build AI that does do that. I think we've just firstly got to have an awareness that that's something that is needed.
We developed a little bit of closing tradition, which is a curiosity question for mapping unexplored territories in HR. And The question I was thinking of for you is, what's one blind spot in current HR practice that you believe people analytics could help illuminate if used with care and intention?
Well, look, I mean, AI is a huge, as I said, it's a new world, and we've seen the roll out of it recently with a new program for government and government employees called AI in Government, and there has been just this absolute drive to be able to use AI, which is fantastic. Everyone wants to use it. We can see the benefits of it, but I do wonder, still if the bias is still a bit of a blind spot, and not for everyone. We know it's being done in research, but I think more so for practitioners on the ground. It's hard to appreciate that something like AI may be biased, and we often assume that technology itself is not. We make the assumption that it is neutral. And so I think perhaps a blind spot is around building that capability amongst HR practitioners and building that knowledge, which people analytics could do, um, around the biases in emerging technologies like AI and how we can move forward with that. I think there's a blind spot and an opportunity around intersectionality. We don't yet engage data to do that well. We still see people in terms of a singular label or a singular cohort, and so I think that would be really interesting to see where we go in terms of using people analytics to better capture the whole person, and not just singular labels.
That's a wrap on this episode of Uncharted HR, where we ventured into the evolving landscape of inclusive E-HRM and the transformative power of people analytics. Together with Catherine Jeffries, we've unpacked the promise and the pitfalls of using data to drive inclusion. From ethical considerations and privacy concerns to the capabilities people need to engage with analytics meaningfully. We've explored real-world scenarios, surfaced challenges, and highlighted how thoughtful design and intentional strategy can turn insights into impact. If there's one takeaway from today's conversation, it's this: inclusion doesn't happen by accident. It's engineered through conscious choices, ethical frameworks, and a commitment to equity embedded in every line of code and every dashboard metric. As we continue to digitize and analyze our workplaces, let's remember that behind every data point is a person, and behind every system, an opportunity to do better. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found value in today's episode, share it with your colleagues, students, or fellow change makers. Subscribe, leave a review, and stay tuned for more explorations into the future of HR. Connect with me, share your thoughts, and let's keep building capabilities together. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the uncharted territories of HR.